Last unit of the school year, our last full unit. We're going to have a few little standalone lessons at the end here before our SBAC testing, but this is the last basically grouping of lessons that you're going to need to know before you go off to high school. Isn't that exciting? So there's 8 lessons. We're going to go over this first one today, which should be a lot of review. If you understood those 4 different types of angles in the warm-up, that'll be a great lead into what we are talking about today. Also, if you did the ED puzzle yesterday, you should know exactly where we're going to go with this, all right? If you didn't get the ED puzzle done, please do that tonight. So first we're going to talk about 4 types of angles, and then we're going to talk about types of angle relationships. Okay, how many people does it take to be in a relationship? 2. So first we're going to go over individual angles, and then we'll look at different combinations of angles in a relationship, right? So the first one, this is something we've talked about a lot. We should be pros at identifying this, and that is a right angle. How many degrees do would a right angle measure? 90 degrees. We know we have a right angle when we see that little square. My right angle is going to look something like that. And there's my little red square in between the angle. Shaped like an L. 2 perpendicular lines forming a 90-degree angle. Again, we talked about this with our right triangles when we learned the Pythagorean theorem. We know that when we see that little square, we're looking at the right angle of that triangle. But what if we have an angle that's less than 90 degrees? What would we call that? Anyone know what we would call less than 90 degrees? Acute angle. Right? So these are small angles like this. See that if we kind of imagine these 2 rays or arrows like the hands of a clock, from A to B, our hands are getting closer and closer together, thus making the angle between those 2 clock hands smaller and smaller. If you look at the clock at the front of the classroom right now, the 2 main hands of the clock are making a right angle, a 90-degree angle, almost perfectly. I think, right? Yeah. But as the time goes on, you'll see it get more and more acute, and then it'll pass itself and then become obtuse, which is our 3rd type of an angle. You've all learned these types of angles before, right? This is like elementary school. Yeah? Hopefully you were awake on Zoom for these lessons. Probably not. Obtuse angle, that's going to be any angle more than or greater than 90 degrees. So you're going to have a big old wide angle like this. Notice how when we're marking the interior of our angles, we're using curved lines. But with a 90-degree angle, we use rigid lines or straight lines to make that little box. But if it's not a right angle, we're going to mark it with a curved line called an arc. Anyone remember what our 4th type of angle is called? A straight angle. What's our angle measure for a straight angle going to be? 180 degrees. We know that we have a straight angle when we have a straight line. Just like that. Straight angle is probably the one that gets forgotten about the most, just because we don't really see an angle, we just see a line. But when we have arrows on the end points of these two lines right here, these two little arrows, this whole thing is one big 180-degree angle. It's going to be super important when we talk about our relationships here in a second. We can kind of envision how all these angles look with some pencils here. If I've got these two pencils, just like that, that would be our right angle, perfect perpendicular 90 degrees. As this top pencil goes further and further down, we see that we're creating an acute angle here, smaller than 90 degrees. If I went the opposite direction, opening this angle up, there's our obtuse angle. And we can open that obtuse angle all the way to get a straight angle, just like that, 180 degrees, where our little erasers are like our midpoint or vertex, and we get a straight line that's a full 180 degrees across. So underneath our little straight angle box, I want you to do just some kind of division line. Because those four ideas we just talked about are all types of angles. Down here, we're going to take a look at angle relationships. So two angles, angle A and angle B, and what type of relationships they can form. Question? Okay. Pretty much review so far. This is all information that we should have in the back of our brains already. These relationships we should also have stored in our brains somewhere, but we'll see. The first relationship that we're going to talk about is two angles. This is the little symbol for angles. Okay, guys, let's focus on this, please. Two angles that add to 90 degrees. All right? And we call those complementary angles. So two angles that add together to equal 90 degrees. It'll look like this, or something like this, where we have angle A there in red. We've got angle B there in blue. And together we can see they make a nice, perfect 90-degree angle. Something we're going to have to do on worksheet 71 is set up an equation that matches this relationship. And we could say A plus B equals 90 degrees. That's our complementary angle equation. Whatever our two angles are, A and B, they're going to add together and equal 90 degrees. So if you're given what A is equal to, it'll be pretty easy for you to find out what B is equal to by just subtracting. What's that? Awesome. I'll put that in the grade book. Just go. and then I'll have you jump in on the second half, and then I'll give you my notes to fill on the top of it, okay? And then you can just worry about gluing later. You can just head back and get started on this. Great job. The second relationship after complementary is supplementary. Again, I'm hoping these relationships sound familiar. Supplementary angles are two angles that add to equal what? Anyone remember from the Ed puzzle maybe? 180. That orange is kind of hard to see, but two angles that add to 180 degrees. This relationship will look something like this. There's my angle A. There's my angle B. So together, complementary angles create a right angle, like we had at the very top. And together, supplementary angles create a straight angle, which we had here in the middle. So if we have supplementary angles, we could say that A plus B equals 180 degrees. There's our supplementary angle equation. Just focus on this, guys. So if we see that we have supplementary angles in a problem and we know what A is equal to, we could find out what B is equal to by solving this little formula. Let's just say that A is 80 degrees, right? 80 plus blank equals 180. Well, what would the measure of angle B be equal to? 100, right? 80 plus 100, that gives me 180. Complementary and supplementary are both terms that basically mean that they go well together, right? If you are like working out a lot and you supplement that with eating healthy, those are two things that work really well together if you're trying to get in shape, right? If you guys are like 13, 14, but there's like workout supplements, which are like additional things that you add to your diet to work well. Again, if you're like trying to get in shape or something like that. Anyone ever been to Texas Roadhouse before? What do you get when you first sit down at Texas Roadhouse? Bread. That bread is complimentary. Okay, it means in the restaurant world it means free, but it complements your meal. It goes well with what you're going to order later on. So complementary angles are two angles that work well together because they form a perfect 90-degree right angle. Supplementary angles are two angles that work well together because they form a perfect 180-degree straight angle. The third relationship that we're going to look at is vertical angles. And this one may not sound too familiar to us, but this is the easiest of them all. Because vertical angles are two angles directly across from each other. Two angles directly across from each other. We know that we have vertical angles whenever we see an X like this, two lines, or two rays technically, forming an X, where my top angle I can call angle A, and my bottom angle will be angle B. Here's one way that we can visualize this. Let's say that I've got my A and my B. Here's my two rays, and they form an X like this. So we got angle A up here on the top, angle B down here on the bottom. Now, based on what you're seeing right now, what type of angle, right, acute, obtuse, or straight, is angle A? Obtuse. It's really large, larger than 90. What about angle B? It's also obtuse. Now, if I take these two pencils and I were to move them to, let's say, something like this, what type of angle is angle A now? Acute. Right? Smaller than 90 degrees. What about angle B? Angle B is acute now as well. And even if we had them perfectly perpendicular, angle A is a right angle, and angle B is also a right angle. So when we have these two angles across from each other like this, they are always going to be equal to each other. So vertical angles don't add together to make some number. They're just equal to each other. So if I have the information provided to me that angle A is 46 degrees and it's directly across from angle B, we know that angle B is also 46 degrees. Whenever I see vertical angles, I always think of a hourglass or a sand timer. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Looks like that. But there's like sand up here, and then it falls down and it counts time like that. So whenever I think of vertical angles, I always see a sand timer like that. All right? Directly across from each other. We're almost done, and this is what we really need to pay attention to. The last one is adjacent angles, and this is the most confusing one. Okay, adjacent angles are two angles directly next to each other. So vertical angles across from each other, adjacent angles next to each other. You guys are all in groups of 4 right now, right? For looking at group 6 here, Avelina and Jordan are vertical angles. They're across from each other. But Avelina and Bree would be adjacent angles because they're right next to each other. Right? Ben and Brianna are adjacent angles. Whoever you're sitting next to, that's your adjacent angle. Whoever is diagonally across from you, that's your vertical angle. Right? Yeah, like Muzda and Alani. You guys are vertical angles, directly across from each other. Kind of diagonally in a way. So adjacent angles can look like a bunch of different things. When it comes to labeling two angles as adjacent angles, what we want to look for is something like this. Okay, and this is where I'm going to lose some people, so I want to make sure we're paying attention. These two angles, A and B, are directly next to each other. They share a center ray. That arrow cutting through the middle is the right side of angle A and the left side of angle B. Kind of like how my classroom and Miss Karan's classroom share a wall in the middle. Yes, sir?
So there's like a complementary angle and a supplementary angle and adjacent angle as well?
Yes, exactly. So if you look up at the board, on the left side, what I wrote in whiteboard marker, there's 3 different types of adjacent angles. Complementary are adjacent angles. They're just a specific type of adjacent angle. Same thing with supplementary. They're 2 angles next to each other, but more specifically, they form 180 degrees, right? When it comes to labeling, which is what we're going to do on the worksheet, we're only going to label adjacent angles when we have neither a right angle or a straight angle. See how these 2 form some type of acute angle? We don't know what that measure is. That's when we have technically an adjacent angle. But because these 2 angles are next to each other, they still are technically adjacent angles. It's like calling a square a quadrilateral, right? A quadrilateral is just a 4-sided shape. More specifically, it's a square where all the shapes are the same length, right? So we're only going to call something adjacent angles when they look like neither supplementary or complementary. So something that looks like that, all right? Where we don't know what the full angle measure is, right? Right. And let's write that in. I'm just going to abbreviate. Complementary and supplementary are 2 types of adjacent angles. Now, they're not always going to be next to each other, but for today's purposes, they will be. We only want to label something as adjacent if it falls under that 3rd category that you see up on the board as neither complementary nor supplementary. Okay, and that's where most of the questions today are going to come from. I just know it. So try and make sure you understand kind of what we're talking about here. Go ahead.